So welcome everyone. This is our second virtual seminar of the GISS Lunch Seminar Series. I want to thank everyone for being here. Today we're going to have McKenna Stanford, who's recently completed his PhD at University of Utah, now is working as a postdoc with Anne Fridland. Without further ado, McKenna, if you want to introduce a little bit about yourself, some of the things that you're working with Anne. For everyone, we're going to follow the template that we did last time with Marcus's presentation, where if you have a question, just note it in the chat. So by default, I've muted everyone, but if you have a question, note it in the chat, and then I'll take note of that and then unmute you. So we're going to be having questions throughout, since that's a little bit more dynamic and natural. So please, McKenna, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Clara. My name's McKenna Stanford. I came from the University of Utah, completed my PhD about 2 months ago, and I'm working with Anne Fridland now. And I've actually got a slide at the very end talking about what I'm going to be working on, so I'll keep you in suspense for now on what I'm going to be doing while at Columbia. But the work I'm going to be presenting today is largely my dissertation work, all of which was guided heavily by my advisors, Adam Varble and Hugh Morrison. And it was really geared towards improving parameterizations and application to deep moist convection, and specifically simulations at the kilometer scale. And what I mean by that are horizontal grid spacings of anywhere from 1 to 4 kilometers. Some would call that the deep convective gray zone. And so some may view this work as primarily geared towards numerical weather prediction, perhaps regional climate modeling, or even research foci where ensemble methods are being used. Let's just get right into it. First of all, what is a stochastic parameterization? Most of you have probably heard the word, but stochastic is just an adjective defined as random. So when we talk about a stochastic parameter, it's just a parameter that is random in some capacity. But how would it be applied to a parameterization scheme? I know most of us at GISS are modelers, but for good measure, let's consider a very simple conceptual model where we have a grid cell and unresolved processes such as microphysics, turbulence, or coarser grid spacings, convection, even though I'm going to be talking about convection allowing models here. These processes have to be parameterized in some extent. So let's take microphysics as an example. And the microphysics at a specific grid cell is going to interact with the model's dynamical core via a heating tendency through microphysical phase changes. Now, within that microphysics scheme are numerous empirical or theoretical parameters for which a distribution of parameters may actually exist. However, most schemes, for simplicity or computational expense, just consider some type of a mean or representative value of that distribution. But conceptually, a stochastic parameterization would account for variability by allowing sampling within that distribution. More broadly, there's a range of justifications for stochastic parameterization. One of them, which is what I'll be focusing on in the first part of this presentation, is observational variability, such as spatiotemporal variability within a cloud, or even variability associated with some environmental dependence, such as temperature. Parameter uncertainty is another reason why we might explore stochasticity. For example, maybe a parameter isn't well observed, or some parameters that are simple artificial constructs of the model, so-called tuning parameters, for which variability might be appropriate. And I think on a more foundational level, it's appropriate in instances of bulk parameterization breakdown, which occurs where there's no longer a large scale separation between the model's grid spacing and the parameterized process. So the current state of stochastic parameterization within the numerical modeling community has advanced pretty greatly over the past 2 decades. And one of the more popular approaches has been the stochastically perturbed parameterized tendency, or SPPT scheme. This isn't a specific scheme, it's more of a method of stochastic parameterization, and it's used, for example, in ECMWF's operational forecast system. And in this type of scheme, the tendencies coming out of a parameterization are perturbed. So the concept is that stochasticity is accounting for uncertainty arising from any number of parameterized processes within that scheme. So that's an advantage of it. It's a catch-all approach to parameter uncertainty, but it doesn't account for uncertainty at its source, which motivates the development of a stochastically perturbed parameter scheme, which is different in that it perturbs individual parameters within a given scheme. This has kind of been recognized within the stochastic community over the past decade as the next logical step in addressing model error, at least model error associated with parameterizations at its most basic level. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And specifically, I'll be talking about stochastically perturbed parameters in parameterization schemes that are known to impact simulated deep noise convection. And in that context, there's a couple of strongholds on simulated convection. One of them being microphysics, where the microphysics schemes have been shown to strongly modulate simulated cloud and precipitation structure. And that's shown here, comparing horizontal cross sections of observed radar reflectivity over Darwin, Australia in the top left. And then in the other three panels showing simulations with the exact same model setup, dynamical core, boundary layer parameterization and everything, and simply using a different microphysics scheme. So this is clearly one aspect of deep convection modeling that needs improvement. In addition to microphysics schemes, the turbulence closure, or the mixing scheme, has been shown to impact convection. I'll demonstrate this by a paper by Varela et al. In 2015, showing here the 5-kilometer pressure anomaly in an idealized supercell simulation using 3D turbulence, there on the left, reducing the dimensionality to be one-dimensional, basically using vertical turbulence only and assuming no mixing in the horizontal, or by excluding explicit mixing at all. We see that the strength and the location of that pressure anomaly, and thus the strength and evolution of the supercell, are heavily modified by the mixing scheme. So that leads us to our primary science questions, which are what's the sensitivity of simulated deep moist convection at kilometer scale grid spacings within the WRF model to stochastic ice microphysics and to stochastic mixing or turbulence. And specifically, we'll be considering horizontal mixing, and vertical mixing is not considered in a stochastic framework here. There are a couple of ubiquitous parts in this work, one of them being the use of a stochastic pattern generator, which was implemented into WRF by Judith Berner at NCAR. And in its simplest form, the generator samples from a Gaussian distribution in which the user prescribes a standard deviation. So for a very raw example, if we take a standard deviation of 2, then we'd get a spatiotemporally evolving pattern of random perturbations that are centered around 0. There's also a maximum limit on that perturbation, which is set by the user. However, we also have control over the space and time scales of those stochastic perturbations. So on the left are perturbations being applied over relatively short space and time scales, where on the right, the perturbations evolve over relatively long space and time scales. So in essence, the stochastic pattern generator that I'm going to be using for all the experiments is dependent on just 3 user-prescribed parameters, which is the sampling distribution standard deviation, a temporal autocorrelation scale, and a spatial autocorrelation scale. I also want to mention a couple of analysis methods so that we're prepared to interpret the results a little more robustly here. I'll always include a control stimulation, which is just going to use the standard non-stochastic scheme of whatever the experiment is that I'm discussing. And then we'll include stochastic ensembles. And when I say ensembles, this is done because several, if not all, stochastic studies have shown that stochastic schemes produce a range of possible solutions. And so in order to properly understand the impact of stochastic schemes, we will always produce a small ensemble of the simulations that differ only in their initial random number seed. However, I do want to stress that we're not going to be analyzing ensembles here in the typical ensemble forecasting skill framework. Instead, we'll focus more on the physical impact of parameter variability on these systems. We'll also always include perturbed fixed parameter ensembles. And all this is an ensemble where each different member uses a perturbed value, for example, maybe doubling or halving of a parameter's magnitude, but that value is fixed throughout the simulation's integration. And this is always important because it provides kind of a maximum limit on parameter sensitivity. And it's also what's been historically done in order to quantify parameter sensitivity. As a floor measure, we're also always going to include an ensemble that I'm going to call theta pert, which stands for theta perturbation. And this is essentially a white noise or a grid scale noise ensemble. And it's going to use the non-stochastic scheme. And the only difference is that each simulation is initialized with very small grid scale perturbations to the thermodynamics. And so one measure of a meaningful signal produced by the stochastic scheme would be if the spread it produces is greater than that produced by the grid scale noise ensemble. And finally, we'll always include some measure of truth, which is either going to be observations or for convective dynamics, which aren't generally well observed, if at all, a large eddy simulation in which the convective drafts are considered to be fully resolved. So with that methodology laid out, we'll go through the stochastic microphysics portion of this work first. And the stochastic framework was implemented into WRF within a specific microphysics scheme called the predicted particle properties scheme, which is a bulk microphysics scheme, but it differs from other modern bulk microphysics scheme. For example, it differs pretty significantly from the Morris-Gettelman scheme in Model E, and that it doesn't have an artificial separation of ice hydrometeor species like graupel, snow, or cloud ice. Instead, it has a single category of ice, but the prognostic properties are ice particle properties. And that includes the total ice mass mixing ratio, the total ice number, the Rime mass mixing ratio, and the Rime volume. This is kind of considered a shift in thinking of ice particle properties within bulk ice parameterizations. And we tested the sensitivity to stochasticity applied to a couple of different parameters. One of them being the mass size relationship for unrimed and partially rimed ice. Now, why do I say unrimed and partially rimed ice if there's only a single ice category? And that's because the P3 scheme actually uses a different mass size relationship depending on what the ice particle properties are. But it only uses 4 different mass size relationships. And herein we're only going to perturb the mass size relationship for ice with properties that define it as primarily grown by vapor deposition. We also evaluate a stochastic ice fall speed scheme, but for brevity, we're only going to focus on the mass size relationship. But at the end, I do have extra slides, and I'm happy to discuss the fall speed scheme if that is of interest. So what is the mass size relationship? Well, it's a simple power law with a prefactor A and an exponent B that defines how bulk water mass is distributed by size. So this means that the relationship essentially determines particle density, and that's shown here through 4 different mass size relationships with particle density on the y-axis versus particle size on the x-axis. So the mass size relationship will determine the density of ice particles. But why is this important in a microphysics scheme? Well, it's used to relate bulk microphysical properties such as the total water content or the simulated radar reflectivity to the particle size distribution. And thus, even outside of numerical models, it's used in radar reflectivity forward models or even satellite simulators. The relationship is also used in combination with the area size relationship to derive the particle fall speed. So it's going to impact sedimentation, but sedimentation of a very specific type of ice. And it's going to impact the ice effective radius, which is the ratio of the third and second moments of the particle size distribution. And thus, it's expected and has been shown throughout the years to impact radiative transfer. The sampling distribution of these mass size relationships is going to be provided by aircraft observations, which is a relatively unique aspect of this study in that we constrain the distribution of sampling parameters due to observations. And specifically, we're going to use ice particle measurements retrieved in the trailing stratiform region of an Oklahoma squall line that occurred during the mid-latitude continental convective clouds experiment in 2011, which was a DOE and NASA co-sponsored project. And so here I'm showing a flight track of one of the legs performed in this trailing stratiform region. And my colleague, Wei Wu, now at the University of Oklahoma, derived mass size parameters, the A and the B parameters, which results in this following distribution, where the exponent of that relationship B is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is a parameter that's proportional to the A parameter. I won't get into why we use something slightly different, but it's proportional to the A parameter. So this parameter space of the prefactor and the exponent in that mass size relationship serves as a sampling distribution for the stochastic scheme. Now, we'll also be evaluating the scheme in simulations of deep convection from MC3E, and we'll focus specifically actually on that same squall line, which occurred on May 20th, as shown here by a map of hourly accumulated rainfall. I'll mention that we did simulate and test other convective modes, such as this bow echo and supercells, but for brevity, we're just going to discuss the squall line. And we ended up using a domain that was meant to somewhat, even though at a smaller scale, represent similarities to the high-resolution rapid refresh model. So it encompasses a large portion of the conterminous US, and we use a grid spacing of 3 kilometers and focus our analysis over the panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And we'll use precipitation observations in this region, as well as satellite retrievals of cloud properties for observational context. And so before getting into the results, a big part of this study, and well, all of the forthcoming results, is presenting the sensitivity within the context of other ensemble configurations, what's been used historically throughout the literature. So this table might initially seem a bit intimidating, but I do promise it'll be easy to understand the results coming forward if I take the time to go through this. So to start, we'll include an ensemble with perturbed large-scale initial and boundary conditions that are provided simply through initialization with various members of the GFS ensemble forecast system. So this is essentially a GESS ensemble. And it's going to provide 10 members that use the non-stochastic microphysics schemes, but rather realizes its range of solutions based on perturbations to the large-scale forcing. I'll note there's no reason to expect for stochastic microphysics to produce as much sensitivity as this ensemble. So this is kind of another ceiling or a cap on sensitivity of these simulations that we've included. And it also provides context of many potential biases associated with the forcing that are not due to the parameterized physics, but rather due to the large-scale thermodynamics or kinematics. We'll also include what I mentioned before is a perturbed fixed parameter ensemble that holds the parameters fixed throughout the model integration, but it's going to alter the values among 4 different simulations. And here I've subjectively chosen the 4 members using the extremes of this distribution. So for these 4 simulations, we'll use each corner of this parameter space. And this does give us an absolute sensitivity to observationally constrained mass size relationships. I'll also include another ensemble, and I'll call that the fixed AB sampled ensemble. And this is similar to the fixed AB ensemble. The difference is that I'm not subjectively choosing which AB values I'm going to include. I choose them randomly from the observed distribution, and then they are held fixed in time and space across the simulation. And this is important because it's essentially the same as the stochastic ensemble. The parameters are randomly sampled, but it would be a stochastic ensemble where the spatiotemporal autocorrelation scale is set to infinity. Oh, I forgot that animation, but yeah, so we just randomly sample from somewhere within this distribution. As I mentioned, we'll include a white noise ensemble, which just initializes the model with small grid scale noise perturbations to the thermodynamics. And finally, we're going to include 3 stochastic ensembles with 5 members in each of the ensembles and an increasing autocorrelation scale. So for STOCHASTIC short, we use a space and time autocorrelation scale of 10 minutes and 10 kilometers. So the perturbations are fluctuating relatively rapidly in space and time. STOCHASTIC mid would be use an autocorrelation scale of 1 hour and 100 kilometers, and STOCHASTIC long will use an autocorrelation scale of 3 hours and 300 kilometers. And then we'll contextualize with observed precipitation and satellite cloud property retrievals. So finally, let's look at some results from these various ensembles, starting with precipitation. So in this figure, I'm just showing the time series of domain accumulated volumetric precipitation. So this is just domain accumulated rainfall. And I've included 2 observational data sets here in the black lines. There's an obvious bias that's associated with the large scale forcing, but is not due to the parameterizations. It's associated to issues with the thermodynamics and the basically the synoptic setup, which is actually a common bias in this particular case. But the rest of the lines here are showing the ensemble means of all of those ensembles that I showed in the last slide. And so we see that the model actually fails to deviate very significantly within the ensemble mean for any of these included ensembles, including the one with large-scale perturbations with perturbations to the large-scale conditions. And that's the ensemble mean. However, there is variability among the ensemble members. I'm showing that here as a time series of normalized spread, which is just the standard deviation normalized by the mean of the ensemble. And this is actually rather intuitive. So the ICBC ensemble in brown, which is the perturbed large-scale initial condition ensemble, produces spread of up to 20% in the domain total rainfall. The fixed AB ensemble in orange, again, generally expected to produce higher sensitivity than the stochastic ensemble, produces the next highest sensitivity. In the yellow is the fixed AB sampled ensemble. So again, a fixed parameter ensemble, but we randomly sample the parameters and they produce the next highest sensitivity. And then finally, our 3 stochastic ensembles are shown in red, blue, and cyan, with the theta perturbation ensemble in kind of in the pink color. And we see a couple of things, notably that the stochastic ensemble produces a relatively small spread, under 10% in the domain total rainfall, that does generally exceed the theta perturbation ensemble. And we also see that using the longer or the larger autocorrelation scale, such as the cyan or the blue line, generally produces a larger spread than when the stochastic scheme is applied over relatively short scales.
Hi, McKenna. I think Anne has a question.
Okay, great.
Hey, McKenna. Can you remind me the control here that's shown? Is that the same horizontal resolution as the colored lines?
Yes, it is. It uses a 3-kilometer horizontal resolution, and it just uses the P3 scheme without the stochastic implementation.
I see. And so everything is 3-kilometer resolution here.
That's right.
You mentioned a, kind of a truth that where things are considered resolved. I believe in one of your earlier slides. Is that I assume that departs more from the from the ensemble mean than these.
That's right. Yeah. So things aren't going to be fully resolved until we get to LES scale around 100 meters or less. These parameterizations at 3 kilometers, the biases are somewhat grid spacing dependent. And that's exactly what we're trying to address, though.
Okay. Oh, do you have a high resolution simulation? Sorry to be daft.
No, that's fine. Not for this particular study. When I get to my stochastic mixing, I will include an LES as truth. Here, we decided to use our computational expense on ensemble setups rather than a high resolution simulation.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep. Okay, so one big caveat to me showing a precipitation analysis with the stochastic microphysics scheme is that ice and convective systems typically has a large degree of rhyming, whereas we are perturbing the mass-size relationship of unrhymed and partially rhymed ice. So it's perhaps reasonable to suspect a greater impact on cloud regions that are more dominated by vapor-grown ice, such as the ANVIL regions formed by convective detrainment and by upper-level convective outflow. And so that's what we're going to look at next. Here's a map of cloud top temperature for this squall line at just a given time. And these hatched regions represent columns that are identified as ANVIL cloud. And so we'll accumulate all of the columns that are identified as ANVIL over the event in order to form distributions of the CIRRUS ANVIL properties. And I won't get into the exact algorithm that we used to identify ANVILs, but it was done to be consistent with the observations in which we used radar and satellite to identify ANVIL columns as well.
Hi, McKenna. I think Anne has one more question.
Sure.
So, sorry, can you go back one more time to the last slide, McKenna? So if you so this is the normalized spread, and I guess my question is, if you went to the left plot and you put the full range of your total ensemble, would any of them include the observed case, which is, and should we be thinking of that as like an ensemble member?
So yeah, and I have certainly done that. I don't remember if I included that in the paper or not. The short answer is no. Even the ICBC ensemble fails to reproduce the observed precipitation, which there's a couple of reasons for that. It actually could be specific to the P3 microphysics scheme. Even though we're perturbing parameters within the P3 scheme, sometimes it's known to underproduce precipitation. But none of the GISS ensemble members were able to produce as much precipitation. But I think this is also a grid spacing problem. At 3 kilometers, the squall line evolves in ways that are different from the observations, mainly by failing to form the same large trailing stratiform region.
Oh, okay. That part I think is quite robust. But in the observations, would you say the uncertainty in the observations is also maybe 20% at least?
I cannot answer that with certainty.
Okay.
I would have to look. The black diamonds here are a quality controlled data set, the ABRFC, which use the typical NextRad retrievals, but are also confirmed by rain gauges over the specific region. But no, I couldn't tell you exactly what the uncertainty is.
Okay. And I see you've used 2 observations, so that kind of shows a little bit of that. Thank you.
Right, yeah. Okay, yeah, so moving on to our CIRRUS ANVIL properties. So like I said, I identified columns that are representative of the ANVILs produced by this deep convective system. And we're just going to look at cumulative distribution functions of the optical depth, the visible optical depth through these ANVIL columns. And so here I'm showing a cumulative distribution function of observations in the black line, which come from a satellite retrieval, the SatCorps data set that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And then I show the control simulation in gray, and then the 10 ICBC ensemble members. And we see that we have a spread of about 20 units in the median optical depth produced by this ensemble. Looking at the theta perturbation ensemble, this is pretty expected. We see that there's little to no spread in the median, but that the largest spread actually comes from the fixed AB ensemble, where we get a spread in the median optical depth of about 70 units. So clearly the mass size relationship is playing a role on the optical depth, which is somewhat expected given its impact on ice effective radius. But as I've mentioned several times, this fixed AB ensemble is rather extreme and perhaps even unphysical in terms of using the extremes of the observed distribution. So looking at the stochastic ensembles, we see that the optical depth CDFs moving from left to right with the shorter to the longer autocorrelation scales, that the spread remains pretty small, and it's actually comparable to the grid scale noise ensemble. Besides, perhaps for the longest autocorrelation scale, which has a spread in median optical depth of about 10 units. Now, optical depth, I'm sure most of you know, is proportional to the vertically integrated mass, or the ice water path, and inversely proportional to the ice effective radius. So changes to the optical depth can either occur through more mass in the column or changes to the ice particle properties within the column. And so in order to determine which is impacting the stochastic scheme, we're going to control for ice water path. So here, this is done by looking at the average optical depth for fixed bins of ice water path. And we see that for the longest autocorrelation scale, there is a spread of about 30 units at its maximum in the optical depth for the same ice water path. Whereas conversely, the ICBC ensemble, despite previously being shown to produce median optical depth variability of up to 20 units, here it produces a very strict relationship between ice water path and optical depth. So the primary conclusion here regarding the stochastic scheme is that for the same amount of vertically integrated ice mass, it's able to produce a variable visible optical depth. And while I'm not going to show this here, we did do some calculations on the cloud radiative effect that results from this and generally leads to differences in average cloud radiative effect through the ANVIL columns of a few decades of watts per meter squared. So yeah, that concludes the stochastic microphysics part of this work, and I'll recap the main conclusions, which is that the stochastic mass size scheme produced variable optical depth for a given ice water path, and at times was able to encompass the observed relationship between these two variables. We found that the spread exceeds that of grid scale noise, at least for longer autocorrelation scales, indicating meaningful, although small, sensitivity to the stochastic scheme. We found that spread increases with increasing autocorrelation scale, which is conceptually understandable given the longer and the larger perturbation forcing when we use those longer scales. And we found that there's a minimal impact on rainfall. And perhaps what I think is the most important result from this is that the perturbed fixed parameter sensitivity is large. And as I mentioned, this is typically what's done in sensitivity studies in order to quantify the sensitivity to a parameter. But if we do something like this, it's likely overestimating the parameter sensitivity, especially in cases where parameter variability is known to exist through observations, as we showed with the mass size relationship. And again, although I didn't show it, I wanted to mention that the stochastic ice fall speed scheme had a larger impact on rain rates with a spread in median rain rates of up to 5 millimeters per hour. And that was mainly because in the stochastic ice fall speed scheme, we were additionally perturbing the fall speed of rimed ice, which tends to impact the rain rates more in convective systems. And this was summarized in a paper put out in James last year, which you can check out for further information.
Hi, McKenna. I think Marcus has a question.
Yep, great.
I'll try not to take too long. But do you think it's fair to say that the stochasticity should only really, whoops, am I muted?
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. That the stochasticity should only really have an effect in cases where there's some sort of feedback or some sort of nonlinearity in the response to the perturbations. I mean, I guess if you have stochasticity but everything is linear, it should just all average out to some extent, right? You need some sort of feedback or nonlinearity to produce some sort of observable effect of stochasticity. Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Which is why the analysis eventually shifted to more towards a radiation analysis rather than a precipitation analysis. And my co-authors and I definitely speculated and have proposed work for this scheme with, for example, mid-latitude cyclones, where sublimation and deposition play a role in altering the potential vorticity. Uh,
Ah,
so
okay. So yeah, so I guess that was the question. Like, what do you see as the sort of channels for these feedbacks to occur in these experiments that you did?
Right. So specifically for the mass size relationship scheme, I would expect to see the most sensitivity in mid latitude cyclones. In terms of deep convective systems, which is kind of what I tried to focus on a little more. And the Greg McFarquhar's group is actually extending this work, and I have a feeling that's how they're going to pursue this, by looking at systems that might be more impacted by uh, this particular stochastic ice scheme.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll move on to the stochastic mixing work, and I say part one here. I do have a part two, but given my time, I have a feeling I'm going to skip it, which is fine because I think part one is a bit more interesting. Um, and so let's jump into that. So what's the motivation for stochastic mixing? And this concept originated from a well-established large control of model grid spacing on convective updraft properties. And so I'll show this, for example, in a paper by George Bryan and Hugh Morrison in 2012, where this is a horizontal cross-section of an idealized squall line at 5 kilometers above ground level with the vertical velocity and color fill and cloud water evaporation rate along the edges of that updraft. So here we're showing a horizontal grid spacing of 4 kilometers. But if we moved to a horizontal grid spacing of 1 kilometer, we see a wider distribution of smaller updraft cores with different core properties. For example, larger vertical velocities in this case, with more cloud water evaporation, largely due to the larger surface area around the edges of the updrafts. And then moving towards LES grid spacing, there's clearly a wider distribution of cores and core properties. So the concept of stochastic mixing is to produce a wider range of updraft core properties, essentially more variable mixing at coarser grid spacing. So at the grid spacings between 1 to 4 kilometers, we know we can't resolve the individual updrafts. But if we change the properties of those updrafts through incorporating a more realistic distribution of properties, and by realistic I mean those coming from an LES, does it have a significant impact? And of course, the goal is to mimic essentially the mass flux distributions at those finer grid spacings. So the goals here are pretty simple. To account for variability in updraft core properties via a stochastic horizontal mixing framework. So we're talking about lateral entrainment of updrafts, and we're not talking about cloud top entrainment. And we'll also, again, place the stochastic mixing sensitivity within the context of perturbed fixed parameter simulations. So first of all, let's define how WRF mixes. What exactly does this mean in a convection allowing numerical model? So if we have just an arbitrary scalar C, then the subgrid scale flux of that scalar within a single dimension given by that subscript I is represented here as the product of an eddy viscosity coefficient, that K sub h, and the horizontal gradient of that scalar within a given dimension. So our setup is going to be using the pretty simple Smagorinsky type eddy viscosity, which increases in regions of strong deformation and instability. So of course this mixing is typically thought of primarily within the boundary layer, but it does occur in the free troposphere as well, primarily in regions of convection or what we know as clear air turbulence as well. We do not consider the prognostic TKE version of mixing for analytical reasons that I won't go into. But in the stochastic mixing formulation, we're going to do something pretty simple and use what we call a multiplicative factor, which is defined as the random perturbation produced by the stochastic pattern generator, that R of xyt, and raising it to the base of 2. And so this essentially allows us to sample around a median multiplicative factor of unity, but the sampling is done in log base 2 space. So our perturbed mixing coefficient will just be the product of the diagnostic coefficient and that multiplicative factor. So again, we have a spatial distribution of the perturbations. And if we look at the spatial distribution of the multiplicative factor within this domain, we see that we have some regions of reduced mixing relative to whatever the control is, and some regions of enhanced mixing. And in order to do this, we're going to use a pretty simple framework this time with quasi-idealized MC3 squall lines. And all I mean by that is that we used an idealized modeling setup, but we initialized the simulations with observed soundings from MC3E squall lines. And as an example, here I'm showing the simulated reflectivity at 2.5 kilometers above ground level at the end of a 6-hour simulation for these squall lines. And I have a baseline simulation here on the left, which uses a horizontal grid spacing of 1 kilometer. And then on the right, what we consider our LES with a horizontal grid spacing of 125 meters. So we see the convective mode here is kind of a simple and well-studied leading convective line trailing stratiform region squall line. And also mention that in the following experiments, when we modify the mixing in these squall lines, we're doing so only after the squall line reaches a quasi-steady dynamical state, which we choose to be 2 hours after the initialization. So this is done to isolate the impact of modified mixing on convective updrafts, primarily within the free troposphere, and avoid differences in the squall line dynamical structure that may occur through modified mixing at initialization. And so, like I said, we'll just have a baseline simulation, which is a kind of out-of-the-box 1 kilometer simulation using the sounding profile from MC3E. And then we'll include a simulation in which mixing is enhanced by a constant factor of 4 throughout the full tropospheric depth. These will be shown in blue solid lines. So the conceptual idea here is that enhancing mixing will reduce updraft vertical velocities.
McKenna, I have a quick question. These are all fixed vertical resolution? You've never kind of...
Yes, fixed vertical resolution. Yeah. We use 100 vertical levels on a stretched grid. Yeah. So in addition to enhancing mixing throughout the full tropospheric depth, we'll also include a simulation where we enhance mixing, again by a factor of 4, but we only do so above 4 kilometers. And this is done to exceed the height of the squall line's cold pool. For anyone who is familiar with RKW theory, we know that squall lines' convective statistics are going to be strongly modulated by the strength of the cold pool. And mixing doesn't occur just in updrafts, it occurs everywhere within the domain. So this is kind of an experiment to attempt to control for mixing within the cold pool and avoiding direct changes to the cold pool strength. 2 more simulations on the other extreme. We're essentially going to turn off horizontal mixing, and we'll do it throughout the full tropospheric depth, which will be shown in red lines, and then we'll do it only above 4 kilometers, which will be shown in dashed lines. We'll do that same framework for the stochastic schemes with 3 members using the stochastic scheme applied to the full tropospheric depth and 3 members applied only above 4 kilometers. with a spatiotemporal autocorrelation scale of 10 minutes and 10 kilometers. And we're not going to test the sensitivity to that scale just yet. This scale was chosen more to scale with the size and lifetime of an individual and training convective updraft. And then we'll include a theta perturbation ensemble as grid scale noise. And like I said before, the large eddy simulation, which will also include as coarse grain to 1 kilometer for a more representative comparison. So this LES is going to act as truth, for which the 1 kilometer simulations should strive to statistically reproduce. Now we'll mainly be looking at these results through vertical profiles of a mean convective updraft vertical velocity, which is essentially a mean mass flux profile. And convective updrafts are defined as vertical velocities exceeding 2 meters per second and total water content exceeding a small threshold, although we did find that the results were sensitive to these rather ad hoc definitions. And we'll perform averaging over the last 2 hours of the simulation, which is from 4 to 6 hours. And so within these profiles, there's a couple of interesting features that are rather intuitive. The first being a low-level maximum and vertical velocity, which is associated with the mechanical lift along the cold pool, and essentially pressure forcing of updrafts below the level of free convection. And then we have a mid-tropospheric maximum of which is generally just buoyant updrafts that reach their level of free convection and maximize in the mid-troposphere. Now, looking at the comparison between our baseline simulation at 1 kilometer and our large eddy simulation shown in gray, we see that below 5 kilometers, the baseline simulation is producing less or smaller vertical velocities, but at upper levels above 5 kilometers, it produces larger vertical velocities, which is kind of a known bias in 1 kilometer grid spacing simulations. Now we're looking at the simulation where mixing is enhanced throughout the full tropospheric depth. And recall, when you enhance mixing, you're reducing horizontal gradients. You expect for vertical velocities to be reduced. And this is the case up through about 8 kilometers above ground level. However, an interesting feature is that above 8 kilometers, vertical velocities are actually enhanced relative to the baseline simulation. This inconsistency is also seen in the reduced mixing case, or in this case, a no mixing simulation, where below 6 kilometers, vertical velocities are enhanced relative to baseline, but above 6 kilometers, mixing is actually reduced relative to baseline. And so this discrepancy actually ends up being somewhat more intuitive if we look at the simulations in which mixing is only altered above the cold pool. So there are indirect effects when you alter the free tropospheric updrafts on the cold pool. But generally, when we keep the cold pool more similar to the baseline simulation, we get a reduction in vertical velocities throughout the full tropospheric depth when we enhance mixing. And if we turn off mixing, we get an enhancement of vertical velocities relative to the baseline throughout the full tropospheric depth. So this essentially tells us, which is not surprising, that modifying mixing within the cold pool modulates the convective dynamics. And I actually looked into this in great detail, which I'm not going to include here, but if there's any questions about how exactly those modifications occurred, I can talk about that after the presentation. So now we look at these same profiles, but for the theta perturbation ensembles in purple and the stochastic scheme applied throughout the full tropospheric depth in cyan. We see that the stochastic simulations generally act to actually enhance upper level vertical velocities, which is relatively undesirable. But as I mentioned, this is actually due to modifications of the cold pool strength. So if we instead limit stochastic mixing to occur only above 4 kilometers, we get a mid-level reduction in vertical velocities, which is somewhat closer to the LES, even though the vertical structure still has some problems. So why do we get that mid-level reduction within the stochastic scheme? even when we control for the cold pull strength. To determine this, we perform a passive fluid tracer analysis. My phone keeps going off even though I have it on silent. So passive fluid tracers were initialized with a value of unity within the bottom 2 kilometers of the model domain at 3 hours into the simulation. So we see this here as essentially a pool of tracers that's transported above 2 kilometers only by upward convective motions. So a half an hour after the tracers were initialized, we see a tracer plume that has reached a height of 12.5 kilometers. And that a couple of hours later, we get a plume that actually represents what we would think of kind of as the reflectivity structure of a squall line looking in the vertical. So with these tracers, we can essentially analyze updraft core dilution. So if we think about a horizontal plane where we have an updraft core here, it's going to have a tracer concentration between 0 and 1. And that tracer concentration is going to depend on the degree of mixing that occurs as it ascends throughout the troposphere. So if there's a higher tracer concentration, that means that the updraft core is less dilute, whereas if there's a lower concentration, it means that the updraft core is more dilute. So now what we're going to do is distribute the updraft cores by their size here on the x-axis. So these are updraft core areas, which you can essentially think of as an updraft core effective radius. And then on the y-axis is the mean updraft core averaged tracer. So for the baseline simulation, these profiles are rather noisy, but we do see that it has larger tracer concentrations than the large eddy simulation, which is expected due to the larger updraft cores that have less mixing compared to the large eddy simulation. Now here are the 3 stochastic simulations where stochastic mixing is applied throughout the full depth. And so we see even though they are noisy, a slight reduction in the amount of tracer for a given updraft core, which is perhaps more noticeable if we look at the stochastic simulations where mixing is only altered above 4 kilometers. And this shows up probably best if we look at the absolute mean across all of the updraft cores, which are shown by these symbols. So the black symbol is the mean tracer concentration, regardless of the updraft size, and the symbols show the tracer concentrations within the stochastic updraft cores. So there is a small level of dilution occurring in the stochastic simulations, and this is essentially due to the more frequent sampling of higher mixing values. Even though it's not a constant value, the more frequent sampling of the larger values aids in that dilution. So I'm wrapping up here, but I wanted to show just a very simple idea of how altering the mixing impacts the precipitation structure of these simulations. So here I'm showing the baseline simulation for simulated reflectivity at 2 kilometers above ground level. And then in the enhanced mixing case, enhanced by a factor of 4, and we see generally smoother reflectivity features with a slower propagation speed due to shown by the further westward placement, which is a reflection of the weaker cold pull in this simulation. If we look at the no mixing simulation where we have no explicit horizontal mixing, we actually see a very high resolution kind of granularity and structure to the horizontal reflectivity with a further eastward placement indicating a stronger cold pull. And this is really interesting because if we look at the LES, it actually produces a structure that is most similar to the LES. And there's a lot of results which are actually indicating, despite the attempts to introduce stochastic mixing, that no mixing in the horizontal is actually producing more favorable results in most of my simulations. But looking at the stochastic simulations regardless, shown here in the bottom panel, a couple of interesting features is that the propagation of the squall line remains rather constant and has a similar positioning as the baseline simulations, and that there's a large degree of variability in the leading convective line, both in terms of the size of the reflectivity cores, the noticeability of the transition region, and in so where some of the stochastic simulations are able to produce a bowing structure. With that, I'll wrap this up with a couple of main points. What's the net impact of stochastic mixing? We found that a decreased mid-level vertical velocity due to more dilute updraft cores. An important question of whether it's important or whether it's an improvement closer to the LES compared to the baseline simulation. We found the answer to be yes, but only when used with caution, and honestly probably not worth the computational expense that the stochastic pattern generator requires. And I will mention that we tested this on other grid spacing. So all of the results I showed were at 1 kilometer, and we also tested them at 500 meters and 2 kilometers. And we found that the sensitivity increases with increasing grid spacing, and that despite some spread among the ensemble members, the stochastic scheme always acted systematically to reduce mid-level vertical velocities. And this work has been accepted pending revisions and monthly weather review, so that should be out within the next couple of months. Now I'm going to completely skip this part 2, but I will show this this animation very quickly. So we extended this stochastic mixing framework and instead looked at a real case simulation of oceanic tropical deep convection that occurred during the AMIE DYNAMO case. This work is also being drafted for publication with some results that were quite a bit different from using the idealized squall line setup, which hints at kind of the necessity to test these types of schemes in both frameworks. And I'm happy to chat with anybody offline about the results of that simulation. So just 2 more slides. I wanted to mention what the implications are for this work. In particular, like how does this study compare to other stochastic studies? And it essentially agrees with other modern studies that stochastically perturbed parameter schemes produce relatively small sensitivity compared to perturbations to the initial and boundary conditions or multi-physics ensembles where we simply use different microphysics schemes, or fixed parameter ensembles where we perturb the parameter but hold it fixed. And this study is different in, I think, one important way, in that most of these stochastic studies tend to look at forecast verification, whereas we looked at the physical mechanisms that actually result from the stochastic perturbations, which is a relatively new concept within WRF. The practical application of these schemes suggests that its efficacy maybe more as a research tool as opposed to operational use. Of course, more parameters need to be tested under, like we mentioned, different weather regimes and also over longer forecast cycles. But perhaps the most important point that came out of this work is the potentially important approach for appropriately quantifying parameter sensitivity. The stochastic scheme is pretty easily adaptable to different models, and the results from my work in this dissertation pointed out that some of the quantifications for parameter sensitivity that have been reported in the literature as we move towards higher grid spacings over the last couple of decades are likely overestimating that sensitivity, especially when there is a strong observational or theoretical basis for variability in that parameter rather than fixed changes. So now finally, what am I doing now at Columbia, which is completely different from what I just showed you, but I'm going to be looking at Southern Ocean clouds, working with some of the recent unprecedented data sets over the Southern Ocean in an attempt to characterize the cloud and precipitation structure with an emphasis on improving the representation of those clouds within GISS's climate model. And collaborations are certainly welcome in that work as I move forward with it. All right, so I went a little long, but I guess I'll open that up to questions.
Great, thank you, McKenna. Does anyone have any more questions? Can't see it in the chat yet. So I just have a quick general question. Do you think also that the fact that the these kind of underestimate the sensitivity relative to, as you said, either the multiphysics and or the uncertainties related to the boundary conditions. Do you think that that's in part related to the fact that you're essentially not capturing what Marcus kind of generally referred to earlier as these feedbacks, so that you're not really kind of getting feedbacks in the large scale flow? Do you think that's one possibility, and or if that is the case, how would you go about quantifying that? What kinds of experiments would you do?
So that actually gets at the whole part of the presentation that I skipped, which is we did extend simulations out to 36 hours, and we allowed the stochasticity to act kind of freely on a couple of different time and space scales. And we actually did see that over, at least for the stochastic mixing scheme, over very large space and time scales, there the mixing scheme actually acts to alter mesoscale organization, and it allows that mesoscale organization to be very variable among the different simulations. So I think the key is that in order for the sensitivity of the stochastic scheme to produce something that is meaningful in order to interact with the large scale, it has to, at least within deep convective systems, it has to impact the mesoscale, the kind of the upscale growth in the mesoscale organization. Otherwise, we have found, and this is no surprise to anybody who's done high resolution convection modeling, especially with real cases, that no matter how much you perturb any of these parameters, they're so strongly constrained by the initial and boundary conditions. And again, unless you're able to fully interact with those scales, then the changes are probably not going to be incredibly meaningful.
Great, thanks. I think Allegra, you're still on. Do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Thanks, McKenna. That was really nice. I was wondering about your passive tracer simulations. It made me think about using water isotopes. Have you ever looked at tracer studies to constrain or make a judgment about which one is better by matching with passive tracers like the water isotopes or otherwise?
No, I have not. I have not looked at that at all. The tracers that we used are essentially a number per kilogram that are associated with the microphysics scheme in these simulations, and they haven't really been used in a lot of studies in general. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I have some opinions on how interpretation of that should be used. But I'm also not incredibly familiar with water isotope analysis, so I couldn't really compare the two.
Okay. And just one quick unrelated question. When you made 4 kilometers your cutoff, is that number generally good around the world, or would there, why not use temperature or something else as the cutoff for the changing your mixing schemes?
Right. So yeah, it was very specific to the squall lines that we were looking at. 4 kilometers was just above the height of the cold pool in those simulations. You could, like you said, use some type of a temperature cutoff. Probably what you would want to do is do it in those simulations as a function of buoyancy, and avoid altering mixing where the buoyancy perturbation was negative, indicating that it was within the cold pool. But at that point, you start messing with model architecture and things that are very specific to a single case and not easily adaptable, which is what we eventually wanted to use this scheme in a more universal capacity. So that's why we didn't pursue that avenue.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, McKenna. I don't think we have any more questions at this time. But yeah, thank you very much for presenting, and thanks everyone for attending. We have another seminar coming up in a few weeks at the end of September. I look forward to everyone coming to that, and I'll be sending the advertisement for that. So thanks again to McKenna, and thanks to you, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the week.
Thanks for organizing, Clara.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.